Captain George Forrest ran through the middle of a North Vietnamese ambush to get back to his men, and in doing so, saved most of Alpha Company from being wiped out during one of the deadliest days of the entire Vietnam War. That is not something you just forget once you hear it, and honestly, there is a whole lot more to this story than most people ever get to know, because for decades the actions of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, have been overshadowed by what happened to the other units that day, and George Forrest has carried that weight, along with the guilt of the 17 men he lost for most of his life. You have to go back to understand how a young man from a small, segregated town in Maryland ended up leading soldiers into one of the most chaotic battles American troops had faced since Korea, and how the lessons of that day shaped everything that came after for him and for the men who served under his command. This is the kind of story that does not get written up in the official histories the way it should be, and the people who lived through it often do not talk about it for years or even decades because the memories are just too raw. But George Forrest eventually did start talking, and what he shared helps us understand not just what happened in the Ia Drang Valley, but what it meant to be a soldier and a leader in a war that would test everything America thought it knew about fighting. George Gaither Forrest grew up in Leonardtown, Maryland, in St. Mary's County during the 1940s and 1950s. And if you know anything about that part of the country back then, you know it was deeply segregated. The Jim Crow laws were in full effect, and black families lived in a different world than their white neighbors, even though they shared the same small town and breathed the same air. Forrest himself said that Leonardtown in those days was separate, but not necessarily equal, and he wanted out of that world as soon as he could get out. There was a kind of quiet dignity required to navigate that system, and George Forrest learned it early from watching his father. His father was Dr. James A. Forrest, who would become the first African-American president of the St. Mary's County Board of Education, and whose name now sits on the Career and Technology Center there. But back when George was young, his father was just trying to make a way in a world that did not make much room for black families, no matter how educated or capable they were. Young George sometimes thought his father was being too accommodating to the white power structure. But when he came back from Vietnam and saw things with older eyes, he realized his father had been playing a long game that required more strength than he had understood as a boy. George Forrest left the county in 1956 to attend Morgan State College, which is now Morgan State University. And it was one of those historically black colleges where young black men and women could get an education and also find a sense of purpose. These schools were producing lawyers and doctors and teachers and military officers at a time when most of America did not think black people could do any of those things. And the students who went there knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. While at Morgan State, Forrest got involved in the sit-ins and the civil rights activities that were part of the larger movement during that time. But he also found something else that would shape his entire life. He found football, and he found the Reserve Officers Training Corps. George Forrest played football at Morgan State, and he was pretty good at it. The coach there had built up something remarkable with a winning streak that stretched over 140 games without a loss at one point, and Forrest was part of that tradition. The first time his team lost in the 4 years he played was against Howard, and that competitive fire, that discipline, that sense of being part of something larger than yourself, it all fed into what Forrest would later bring to the Army. He went through the ROTC program at Morgan State, and when he graduated, he received his commission as an officer in the United States Army. It was a path that would take him places he could not have imagined growing up in Leonardtown, including standing as an honor guard at the funeral of President John F. Kennedy, and commanding the guards at the tomb of the unknown soldier before he ever set foot in Vietnam. Forrest went through officer basic course and then airborne school. where he admits he graduated with the minimum number of jumps required. He laughed about it later, saying he was not exactly a natural at land navigation or marksmanship, and there is this phrase he used, that he could not hit a bull in the butt with a bass fiddle. But what George Forrest lacked in certain technical skills, he made up for in leadership, and in his ability to learn from the NCOs around him. He talks often about a man named Sergeant Meddy, who taught him everything he needed to know to survive, and those lessons Forrest would later overlay on everything else he did in life, including coaching football and working in education and raising his own sons. After airborne school, Forrest was assigned to Fort Ord in California, and eventually he found himself with the 11th Air Assault Division, which was being reorganized and renamed as the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile. This was the new way of war the Army was developing, with helicopters that could insert troops deep into enemy territory and extract them just as quickly. The concept had been tested and refined through extensive exercises, and the idea was that these air cavalry units could move faster and hit harder than anything the enemy had seen before. The helicopter was going to be the horse of the modern cavalry, and the soldiers who rode those machines into battle were going to have mobility that their fathers, fighting in the Pacific, and their grandfathers fighting in France could only have dreamed about. The men who would make up this division trained hard in South Carolina, where the weather and terrain were similar to what they would face in Vietnam, and the exercises were intense. They practiced air assaults, landing in hot zones, moving to contact, securing positions, and extracting under fire. They learned how to coordinate with helicopter gunships and how to call in artillery and close air support. They built unit cohesion and learned to trust each other the way soldiers have to trust each other when everything depends on the man next to you doing his job right. And in early August 1965, they boarded ships in Charleston for the long journey across the Pacific to put everything they had learned to the ultimate test. Captain George Forrest and the rest of the 1st Cavalry Division sailed from Charleston on the USS Buckner, a World War II-era troop ship, and it took them weeks to reach Vietnam. The rule was that your tour began once you left the States, so for Forrest and his men, the first 24 or 25 days of their Vietnam tour happened at sea, rolling across the Pacific, watching the horizon, and wondering what they were sailing into. Some of the men got seasick, and some played cards, and some just stared out at the water thinking about home and what they had left behind. The ship stopped in various ports along the way, and the men got brief glimpses of other parts of the world before continuing on toward the war. When they finally arrived, the men of Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry thought they were going to storm a beach somewhere like their fathers had done at Normandy or in the Pacific during World War II, but instead they found the 1st Cavalry Band playing music to greet them. It was not quite the dramatic entrance they had expected, and some of the men laughed nervously at the anticlimax. But Vietnam would provide plenty of drama soon enough. The reality of arriving in country was more bureaucratic than heroic at first. There were formations and paperwork and orientation briefings and all the mundane details that armies everywhere have to deal with before they can get to the business of fighting. But underneath it all was a growing tension, because everyone knew they had not come all this way to fill out forms. The 1st Cavalry set up their base camp at An Khe in the Central Highlands, and the living conditions were not too bad at first. The men kept busy building their camp and doing the kinds of things soldiers do when they are waiting for the war to start in earnest. Forrest talks about wrestling matches between the officers and the enlisted men, and how at first they were dismissive of both the enemy and the Vietnamese people they were supposed to be protecting. It was a common attitude among American troops early in the war, before they understood what they were really up against. George Forrest would later return to Vietnam years after the war, and he realized then that the Vietnamese were human beings like any others with the same fears and hopes. and that realization changed how he thought about everything that had happened. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry got used to being attached to other units, which was something Forrest came to hate. Being attached, he said, was like being the red-headed stepchild. You did not know the people you were working with, and they did not know you. And when things went wrong, there was no guarantee anyone was going to come help you. The company did highway security work along the roads running from Khe Sanh to An Khe and on to Pleiku in the Central Highlands. They did river crossing operations, which was new to them, since they had not trained for that much in South Carolina. They took their first casualty in a disappointing incident that had to do with the Chu Hoi program, which was supposed to turn Viet Cong defectors into allies who could help American units. But Forrest quickly figured out that some of the Chu Hoi at his base were not what they seemed, because the mortar fire that came in at night was way too accurate. Someone was giving the enemy targeting information. What George Forrest valued most during those early months was the quality of the men around him. He had excellent NCOs, including Sergeant Rogers and Sergeant Vaught, and Freddie Owens, whose first sergeant had served in Korea and knew what real combat looked like. These men were the backbone of the company, and they would prove it when everything went wrong. The battalion commander and the operations officer and the other staff were all professionals, and Forrest felt comfortable knowing he could count on getting the supplies and support he needed when he was with his own battalion. That comfort would be stripped away in November 1965, when Alpha Company was attached to a unit Forrest had never worked with before and sent into a battle that no one was prepared for. In mid-November 1965, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, was doing highway security in the Deo Mang Pass when Captain George Forrest got a call on the radio that a unit was heavily engaged in the Ia Drang Valley. The Ia Drang was a remote area in the central highlands of South Vietnam near the Cambodian border and the Chu Pong Massif, a massive mountain that straddled the border and served as a sanctuary and staging area for North Vietnamese forces coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American intelligence had detected activity in the area, and the 1st Cavalry Division was sent in to find and destroy the enemy. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, had landed at a place called Landing Zone X-Ray near the base of the Chu Pong Massif, and had run into multiple regiments of North Vietnamese Army regulars. It was the first time battalion-sized American forces had faced off against trained NVA troops in a major engagement, and the fighting was fierce. Moore's battalion of roughly 450 men had landed in the middle of an enemy base area and found themselves surrounded by nearly 2,000 NVA soldiers who were determined to destroy them. The battle at LZ X-Ray had raged for 2 days already, with multiple human wave attacks being beaten back by the Americans using artillery, close air support, and desperate small arms fire. The North Vietnamese were learning how to fight the air cavalry, and the Americans were learning just how tough and determined their enemy was. Forrest was told to assemble his men on the highway because they were going to be picked up and sent in as reinforcements. Normally, that meant Huey helicopters would come in and they would load up and fly to wherever they were needed. But this time, Forrest looked up and saw 2 CH-47 Chinooks coming in. Those were the big twin-rotor helicopters that were usually used for hauling cargo and heavy equipment, not for air assaults into hot landing zones. George Forrest jumped up on the skid of one of the Chinooks and talked to the pilot, who told him they were supposed to take him to a place called LZ Columbus. Forrest asked if the landing zone had been prepped with artillery or if there was any fire support or reconnaissance, and the pilot did not have answers to any of those questions. The pilot did not even have proper maps, so he gave Forrest the one map he had just to get them in. That should have been a red flag right there, and Forrest knew it. But he was an infantry-trained captain who saluted and followed orders. He called his battalion commander on the radio and asked what was going on, and all he was told was that he had orders to go from where he was to LZ Columbus. So they loaded onto those Chinooks and flew into an unprepared, unsupported landing zone, with no artillery, no reconnaissance, no nothing. When Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry landed at LZ Columbus, there was nobody there. No artillery support, no infantry, no security, just an empty clearing in the jungle. Forrest later said it was fortunate that the North Vietnamese did not know they were coming. Or maybe the enemy thought these Americans were absolutely crazy to come in like that, because if there had been enemy troops waiting for them, they would have been history. They made it down safely, and Forrest was finally able to reach the operations officer for Hal Moore's battalion, who told him he needed to move about 3 or 4 kilometers to the west to reach LZ X-ray. So they started walking, and this was on November 15, 1965, the second day of the battle. Captain George Forrest and Alpha Company walked into LZ X-ray, not knowing what they were getting into. On the way, they passed dead bodies scattered in the jungle, and Forrest said to his radio operator, "This does not look so nice." He said, "I think we have just walked into hell." When they reached the landing zone, the first person Forrest saw was Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who had a reputation as one of the finest combat commanders in the Army. Forrest had never served directly under Moore and did not know him personally, but he knew who he was. Moore looked at Forrest and said, "Get your ass in the line and hold." And that is exactly what Forrest did. He saluted and took his company into position on the perimeter, and they were there that second night when the North Vietnamese made their most determined effort to overrun the landing zone. George Forrest later admitted that what he had imagined combat would be like was nothing close to reality. He was petrified. The sounds and the smells and the sheer intensity of combat were unlike anything that training could prepare you for. His company held their sector and repelled at least 3 attacks or probes during the night. They were not major attacks, but they were serious enough, with NVA soldiers testing the perimeter, looking for weak spots. The North Vietnamese were good soldiers, well-trained and motivated, and they were not afraid to die for their cause. They came at the American positions in the darkness, moving through the elephant grass and launching assaults that were beaten back only by concentrated firepower. The men of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry, had never been in a fight like this before, and neither had most of the other American soldiers in the Ia Drang. This was not Vietnam as they had imagined it, with guerrilla fighters melting into the jungle. This was conventional infantry combat against a determined enemy that wanted to close with them and destroy them. Forrest did not lose anybody that night, in part because they had moved into positions that had already been dug by troops who had vacated them, so they did not have to dig their own holes. Fighting positions were critical because they gave you cover from enemy fire and a place to defend from. The men who had dug those positions originally had been fighting for days, and some of them were dead or wounded and evacuated, but their holes were still there, and Alpha Company took advantage of them. They had a full basic load of ammunition and plenty of water because they had just been supplied before they came in. Alpha Company was in good shape, with maybe 97 or 98 men present for duty, and they were solid. The perimeter held through the night, and when morning came, the situation had stabilized enough that they could start thinking about what came next. But that was about to change in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next morning, on November 16th, the situation at LZ X-ray was stabilizing. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry had held through multiple assaults, and reinforcements had arrived, including Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry and elements of the 2nd Battalion 5th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Bob Tully. The 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade also came in to relieve Moore's battered unit. At the morning briefing, the commanders were told that B-52 bombers were going to put in an arc light strike on the Chupong Massif, and everyone had to get outside a 3-mile safety box around the landing zone before the bombs started falling. Forrest was thinking, okay, the helicopters are coming to take us out, because the helicopters always came. But then word came down that they were going to walk out of there. And George Forrest used what his mother would have called the old bad language, because he knew this was not going to be good. Captain George Forrest was told that Alpha Company 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry was being attached to the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel McDade, and they would be walking out together. The order of march was set, and Alpha Company was last in line. Not again, Forrest thought to himself, because being last was never a good position. But in this case, it would turn out to be something of a blessing in disguise. McDade's battalion was heading to a clearing called LZ Albany, about 2 miles to the north-northeast, where they were supposed to be picked up by helicopters and extracted. The plan seemed straightforward enough on paper. Walk out of X-ray before the B-52s dropped their bombs, move to the pickup zone, load onto the helicopters and get out of this God-forsaken valley. But nothing in war is ever as simple as it sounds on paper. The column stretched out over about 500 meters of trail through elephant grass and jungle, with reconnaissance platoon at the front, followed by Alpha Company's 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry, then Delta Company, then Charlie Company, then the headquarters element, and finally Forrest's Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry at the very rear. The terrain was brutal. The elephant grass was waist-high in some places and chest-high in others, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The jungle canopy overhead trapped the heat and humidity and made every step feel like you were walking through a steam bath. The men were exhausted, having been in constant combat or on alert for days without proper sleep. Some of them were carrying loads of 80 to 100 pounds of equipment and ammunition. They were strung out and tired, and their guard was down in ways that would prove catastrophic. Sergeant Fred Kluge was the platoon sergeant for 1st Platoon in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, and he was a veteran who had seen the elephant before, as the old soldiers used to say. Kluge had enlisted in the Army as a 17-year-old high school dropout back in 1950 and had fought in Korea with the 187th Regimental Combat Team, which was one of the elite airborne units that saw some of the toughest fighting of that war. He had learned what combat was like, and he carried those lessons with him every day. Between wars, he had taught map reading and small unit tactics at Army schools, passing on what he had learned to the next generation of soldiers who would need those skills in places like Vietnam. Klug was originally supposed to go to Special Forces, but he ended up in the 1st Cavalry Division instead and was assigned as a platoon sergeant in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, under Captain George Forrest. At 32 years old, Kluge was older than most of the soldiers in the company, and he had a steadiness about him that only comes from experience. He knew what could go wrong, and he knew how to keep men alive when everything went to hell. The Army runs on its non-commissioned officers, and men like Fred Klug were the backbone of every unit that fought effectively. They knew how to translate the orders of officers into practical action on the ground, and they knew how to maintain discipline and focus when soldiers were scared and exhausted and wanted nothing more than to get home. Kluge looked at Captain George Forrest that morning before they stepped off and said, "Sir, we do not know what is going on up there, so we need to maintain some kind of tactical integrity." It was the kind of advice that young officers needed to hear from experienced sergeants, and Forrest was smart enough to listen, because he knew that men like Kluge had forgotten more about surviving in combat than most soldiers would ever learn. They decided to follow the Benning school book for moving in unfriendly areas with security out front and on the flanks and in the rear. Every soldier in Alpha Company knew their job and knew where they were supposed to be and what to do if contact was made. Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry was going to do this right, even if nobody else in the column was paying attention. That decision made by Kluge and agreed to by Forrest would end up saving lives. The column had been walking for a couple of hours when it stopped, and the word came over the radio that Lieutenant Colonel McDade wanted all the company commanders to come forward. The lead elements had either reached or were approaching LZ Albany, and McDade was going to brief them on how he wanted to deploy the battalion. George Forrest did not question why the colonel did not just use the radio to give orders, and instead wanted everyone to walk up to the front of the column. He gathered his 2 radio operators, Larry Hess and Jimmy Smith, and they started walking up the line of troops. What Forrest saw along the way troubled him deeply. Men were sitting on their packs, smoking and joking and eating sea rations, and some of them were sleeping. It looked like a picnic, not a tactical movement through enemy territory. Captain George Forrest would later say that this was where the story got difficult for him, because he often thought about why he did not stop and tell those soldiers to get up and get prepared for whatever might happen. He was an officer, and he could have said something, but he did not do it. The guilt of that failure stayed with him for years, along with the guilt of the men he lost. When Forrest finally started talking about LZ Albany decades later, he said he was carrying around demons that he was only just getting rid of. Those men sitting on their packs belonged to other companies in the 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry, and they were not his responsibility directly, but Forrest still felt he should have said something. George Forrest and his 2 radio operators were making their way up the column when they started hearing incoming mortar rounds. At first, Forrest was not sure if they were American rounds prepping the landing zone or something else, because American units would sometimes do reconnaissance by fire before landing. But when the rounds started falling close, Forrest knew this was enemy fire. He said to Hess and Smith, "We need to get the hell out of here," and they took off, running back down the trail toward where Alpha Company was supposed to be. What Forrest did not know at that moment was that the North Vietnamese 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment, along with elements of the 33rd Regiment, had been resting in the jungle just 100 meters or so from where the American column had stopped. The enemy scouts, who had been captured at the head of the column, had been part of a reconnaissance element, and when they were grabbed, the rest of the NVA soldiers knew the Americans were there. The NVA commander began organizing his forces to attack, and when the assault came, it came from multiple directions at once. The North Vietnamese had sprung an ambush on the column, and it happened so fast that most of the company commanders who had been called forward were now trapped away from their men. The entire center of the column was being hit from multiple directions, in what would turn out to be a classic L-shaped ambush that caught the Americans completely by surprise. Men dropped into the elephant grass trying to find cover, but the grass was so thick that they could not tell friend from foe more than a few feet away. The sounds of AK-47 fire and American M16s and machine guns mixed together in a continuous roar. Men screamed for medics and shouted warnings and tried to organize some kind of resistance, but the chaos was overwhelming. Captain George Forrest ran. He ran as fast as he could back toward his company, because he knew that the only safe place on that battlefield was with his own men. The run was several hundred meters through the middle of an active ambush, with bullets cracking past him and men fighting and dying all around. He knew that if he could get back to Sergeant Rogers and Sergeant Klug and Freddie Owens and Larry Hess and Terry Martell and Jim Patswell, he would be good, because those men would fight like hell to survive. They were his people, and they would protect him just as he would protect them. The bullets were coming from the sides, and Forrest could see other soldiers fighting in the grass, but he kept running because his company needed him, and he needed them. Some of the men he passed were from the other companies in the column, and they were in desperate straits, fighting for their lives in small groups, or as individuals, trying to survive the onslaught. But Forrest could not stop to help them, because if he stopped, he would die, and his company would be without its commander. It was one of those terrible calculations that combat forces on you, where you have to choose between trying to help everyone and making sure you can still help the people who depend on you most. Later, when people asked him about that run, Forrest would say it was more about getting himself to safety than anything heroic, because he did not know anybody in the 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry. His safety was at the end of that column with his own soldiers. Joe Galloway would later describe that run as the fastest 600-meter dash ever run in the history of mankind, and the distance seemed to grow with each retelling. George Forrest himself would joke that depending on the audience and the number of beers he had, the run got longer every year, and the older he got, the faster he ran. But underneath the humor was a truth that every combat veteran understands. Fear is a powerful motivator, and when your life is on the line, you are capable of things you never thought possible. As George Forrest ran back toward Alpha Company, he assumed his 2 radio operators were right behind him, because that was how it always worked. Larry Hess and Jimmy Smith were always there with the radio handset ready whenever Forrest needed to communicate. He never had to look back for them because they were professionals, and they knew their jobs. But during that run through the ambush, Forrest did not turn around to check on them. He was moving fast, and bullets have a way of motivating you to move even faster. When Forrest finally made it back to where Alpha Company was forming a perimeter, his radio operators were not there. They were 2 of the 17 men he lost that day, and Forrest believes they were killed while running right behind him. He never saw exactly what happened, and that uncertainty would haunt him for decades. When Captain George Forrest got back to his company, his training and instincts took over. They circled up and established a defensive perimeter. Everything inside that circle was good, and anything outside was hostile. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry, hunkered down for the night as the fighting raged further up the column. They were being probed by enemy soldiers, testing their defenses, and the entire area was chaos. The North Vietnamese had caught the American column spread out and vulnerable, and the results were catastrophic for several of the companies. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry, lost 45 killed and more than 50 wounded, which was the heaviest casualties of any unit that fought at Albany. The 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry as a whole had been reduced from nearly 400 men to a small perimeter of survivors around the Albany clearing. Around midnight, Captain George Forrest was working the radio when he picked up a call from someone using the call sign Ghost 46. It was a lieutenant from the 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry named Bob Jeanette, who was the weapons platoon leader for Charlie Company. Jeanette was wounded badly, having been hit at least 4 times during the afternoon, but he had held on to his radio and was calling in artillery strikes on groups of North Vietnamese who were moving through the grass, killing American wounded. Jeanette said he was wounded, and there were a lot of other wounded men out there with him, and they needed help. He could hear the enemy talking and shooting in the darkness around him. George Forrest made the decision that he was going to take a patrol out there and bring those men back. Sergeant Fred Kluge heard Captain George Forrest's plan and told him straight up that it was not a good idea. He said, "Sir, you cannot help those guys out there, and we need you here, so I will go." Kluge took a medic named Daniel Torres and some stretchers, and they went out into the darkness to find Ghost 4-6 and the other wounded Americans. When they got there, Kluge called back on the radio and said, "Sir, we do not have enough stretchers." Someone was going to have to stay out there with the wounded who could not walk, while Kluge brought back the ones who could move. Daniel Torres, the medic, said he would stay. Daniel Torres was a Specialist 5 from El Paso, Texas, and by all accounts he was a quiet man. George Forrest remembers him as a gentle soul who spoke barely above a whisper, and who you would never hear saying more than a few words at a time. The enemy was moving through the battlefield, finishing off American wounded, and Torres was determined that would not happen to the men in his care. He killed an unknown number of North Vietnamese that night, protecting those wounded soldiers. Captain George Forrest would later say that if anybody should have gotten the Medal of Honor for what happened at LZ Albany, it was Daniel Torres. Joe Galloway, the war correspondent who wrote the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, tried for years to find Torres to tell his story, but Torres had returned to El Paso after the war and did not talk about what he had done. He signed a copy of the book for Torres's son with the inscription, "Hero Medic of LZ Albany, we remember your dad who kept over 40 wounded soldiers alive and safe through the longest night of their lives. We looked for him for years in the wrong town. Be proud of him always." Torres passed away from a stroke in 1997, before his full story was widely known, and before his children really understood the magnitude of what their father had done that night in the Ia Drang Valley. The fighting at LZ Albany continued through the night of November 17th and into the next day. Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry had held their perimeter at the rear of the column, and around midnight, Forrest got back in touch with his battalion commander who sent Bravo Company under Captain Buse Tully to reinforce them. Tully was a name Forrest knew because he was in the same brigade and his nephew had become a company commander in Forrest's battalion, so there was a connection there. When Bravo Company arrived, they linked up with Alpha Company and pushed the perimeter out, expanding the safe zone and making it possible to evacuate the wounded. Tully and Forrest conferred about what to do next, and Tully wanted to push forward toward the Albany clearing through the ambush site to link up with whatever was left of the other companies. Sergeant Kluge told him straight up that he would not make it 100 yards up that trail, and Kluge was right. Bravo Company took fire immediately and lost men before Tully decided that was not such a good idea after all and pulled back. They set up a joint 2-company perimeter and gathered as many of the wounded as they could find. Helicopters came in to evacuate the worst cases, flying into the landing zone under fire and lifting out soldiers who would have died without medical attention. The dust-off crews were incredibly brave, flying into places that any sane person would have avoided because there were wounded men who needed them. The next morning, they went out into the ambush site to recover the dead. Captain George Forrest sent Sergeant Kluge out with a roster of names and men from each platoon to walk the battlefield and identify all the American dead. What they found was horrifying. There were bodies everywhere, many of them torn apart by artillery and napalm, and the airstrikes that had been called in during the fighting. The Air Force had dropped bombs and napalm on the enemy positions, but the two sides had been so intermingled that some of those bombs had fallen on Americans as well. Friendly fire is one of the ugliest aspects of combat, and it happened at Albany, because when you are fighting that close to the enemy and calling in fire support, there is no way to avoid it entirely. Kluge, who had seen combat in Korea with the 187th Regimental Combat Team, said he had never seen anything that bad. The bodies were scattered through the elephant grass for hundreds of meters, and some of them were hard to identify because of what had happened to them. The men who did this work would carry those images with them for the rest of their lives. George Forrest lost 17 men killed in action at LZ Albany and had 47 wounded. That was 60% casualties for Alpha Company 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. He lost 2 lieutenants, including Shorty Rogers and Sergeant Vaught. He lost his 2 radio operators who had been running right behind him. And he lost a young soldier named Azkarian, who would become the source of one of the hardest things Forrest ever had to do. Azkarian was reported wounded and evacuated during the battle, but when Forrest got a letter from the soldier's mother a couple months later, asking why she had not heard from her son, they started checking the hospitals and found no record of him. Azkarian had been killed in the battle, and his body had been left behind when the units pulled out. It was not until April of the following year, when Hal Moore led a group back into the Ia Drang Valley, that they found his boots and confirmed he was one of the 4 missing soldiers they had been searching for. Captain George Forrest had to write a letter to that mother telling her that her son had been left on the battlefield, and he said it was the hardest thing he ever had to do in his life. The lesson George Forrest took from LZ Albany was simple. Never be attached. He told his battalion commander when he got back, "Please do not ever attach us to anybody without some assurance that when I get in trouble, someone is going to help me." Being attached meant you did not know the people you were working with, and they did not know you, and when everything went sideways, you were on your own. Forrest's company at the rear of the column had fared better than the units in the middle precisely because they had maintained tactical discipline and kept their security out even when everyone else was relaxing. The companies ahead of Alpha Company were devastated. Jack Smith's company had only 8 guys left when it was over. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, and Forrest got in trouble later at the advanced course when they were teaching it as a meeting engagement, and he raised his hand and said, "If I have a meeting engagement like that, I do not want to meet the guy who arranged the meeting." While the rest of the 3rd Brigade went back to base for Thanksgiving dinner after the Ia Drang battles, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry, did not get that break. They went straight on to Bong Son and the next big fight, which was Operation Masher, that would later be renamed Operation White Wing, because President Johnson thought the original name sounded too aggressive for a country that was supposedly trying to win hearts and minds. This operation started in late January 1966, just 2 months after the Ia Drang, and it targeted the North Vietnamese Sao Vang Division, which was operating in the Bong Son area of Binh Dinh Province in northeast South Vietnam. The operation was led by newly promoted Colonel Harold Moore, the same man who had commanded at LZ X-Ray, and it would prove to be one of the deadliest and longest battles of the entire war. For 6 weeks, the 1st Cavalry fought the 3 regiments of the Sao Vang Division across 30 miles of coastal plain and jungle-covered mountains. The 1st Cavalry demonstrated that it had the firepower, mobility, and leadership to find the enemy and deliver severe blows. But the operation also showed the limits of search-and-destroy tactics, because within weeks of the Americans leaving, the North Vietnamese started filtering back into the same areas. George Forrest and Alpha Company moved into Pleiku Province, and then toward the coast, fighting the same kind of operations that would define the American war in Vietnam. They moved from one fight to the next with barely any rest between them. Forrest had men in his company who were just 15 days away from going home, and he had to motivate them to go back out into the field again. These were soldiers who had every reason to be short-timers, counting the days until their plane took off. But Forrest needed them in the fight. and they went. But what he found was that LZ Albany had made Alpha Company better. The men who survived that battle cleaned their weapons without being told. They did not complain about how much ammunition they had to carry. They did not complain about water. They did not complain about walking. And they did not curse the helicopter pilots when the birds could not come in, because they knew the dust-offs would always be there when they could. The dust-off pilots, the medevac crews, who flew into hot landing zones to evacuate wounded soldiers, were some of the bravest men in Vietnam, and the infantry depended on them completely. Forrest said he would have put his company up against any company in the division after that fight, because they were sharp, and they were battle-tested, and they had gone through hell and come out the other side. Captain George Forrest was emotionally drained for 2 weeks after LZ Albany. Fear, he said, takes more out of you than you realize at the time. When people asked him about running back through that ambush, the story seemed to get longer with every telling, and he would joke about that, saying, "The older I get, the faster I ran." But the truth was that fear is a motivator, and the only safe place for Forrest on that battlefield was with his own men, and the closer he got to them, the more his confidence returned. What did not go away was the emptiness of going into formation and seeing that Sergeant Rogers was not there. Rogers was the first platoon sergeant, and he was always the first one up in the morning, and now he was gone. Sergeant Vaught was not there. Larry Hess, the OCS graduate who had been his radio operator, was not there. His executive officer was wounded and had been evacuated. Forrest was looking around for people who were not coming back, and that emotional drain stayed with him until 1993, when he returned to Vietnam and sat down with the men who had fought on the other side. George Forrest returned to Vietnam in 1993 as part of a delegation that included Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, the war correspondent who had been in the thick of the fighting at LZ X-Ray, and who would co-author the book We Were Soldiers, Once and Young. It had been almost 30 years since the battle, and the world had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted back in 1965. The Cold War was over, and America and Vietnam were moving toward normalized relations, and the veterans of both sides were getting old enough that they wanted to understand what had happened and maybe find some kind of peace with it. They met with former North Vietnamese commanders, including Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu An, who had commanded the enemy forces in the Ia Drang, and other officers who had been at the battle. Forrest was struck by something as he sat across from these men who had been trying to kill him and his soldiers all those years ago. The enemy commanders had the same concerns he had. They wanted to protect their troops and get them home safe. One of the NVA company commanders told a story about how his unit had left Hanoi the same month the 1st Cavalry shipped out from Charleston, and how they had marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for months just to get to the battle. They had walked hundreds of miles through jungle and over mountains, carrying their weapons and supplies on their backs, while the Americans had sailed on ships and flown on helicopters. And unlike the Americans who rotated home after a year, the North Vietnamese soldiers did not get to go home. Death or victory was their term of enlistment, and for most, death came first. They fought for 10 more years after the Ia Drang before the war finally ended, and the survivors were old men by then. Forrest also thought about what it must have been like for those men after the war, because unlike the Americans, who at least eventually got their parades, the North Vietnamese veterans were not welcomed home as heroes either. They had, technically, lost the battle at LZ X-Ray, and their losses were staggering, with hundreds killed, and their country sent them right back into the fight for another decade. Walking the old battlefields and talking to the former enemy helped George Forrest understand that war does not just happen to one side, and that the men on both sides of any conflict carry their own burdens and their own grief. George Forrest served 23 years in the United States Army. After Vietnam, he went to the Old Guard as an operations officer, which is the ceremonial unit that provides military honors at Arlington National Cemetery and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, among other duties. It was prestigious work, and Forrest brought everything he had learned in combat to that assignment. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of an infantry battalion in Germany during the Cold War, when American forces in Europe stood ready to defend against a Soviet invasion that thankfully never came. Those were the years when the Army was rebuilding after Vietnam, trying to shake off the dysfunction and demoralization that had plagued the force in the later years of the war. Officers like Forrest, who had combat experience and knew what worked and what did not, were essential to that rebuilding effort. When he retired from the military, he returned to his alma mater, Morgan State University, where the athletic director was looking for someone to help improve the academic performance of student athletes. The graduation rates for athletes were pretty low, and the school wanted to do something about it. Forrest came back as an academic advisor, but the job changed, as these things often do, and he picked up additional duties as a defensive coordinator for the football team. Eventually, he became the assistant head coach, working with young men who reminded him of himself at that age. What was most rewarding for him, he said, was seeing in those young men what his own coach had seen in him years before, something called latent potential. These were kids who had the ability to succeed, but had not yet figured out how to unlock it, and Forrest knew how to help them find that key, because someone had done the same for him. One of his players went on to become Lieutenant General Scott Dingle, the Surgeon General of the United States Army, and Forrest was the godfather of his son. Another former player became a pharmaceutical manager for the entire southern region of the country, running major operations and leading teams. These were kids who had done just the minimum to get by when they came to Morgan State, and Forrest helped them find more in themselves than they knew they had. Lieutenant Colonel George Forrest retired from the Army and went on to hold positions at St. Mary's Riken High School as Director of Students and at St. Mary's County Technical Center as Principal. He served on boards of directors for St. Mary's Hospital and Tomorrow's Child, and the historic Sotterly Foundation, and the Governor's Southern Maryland Higher Education Center. In the early 2000s, George Forrest became the first African American to hold the position of County Administrator for St. Mary's County, Maryland, which was the highest-paid, non-elected position in the county. He had come a long way from the segregated town where he grew up, wanting to get out and see the world. His father, Dr. James A. Forrest, who had navigated that same segregated world with quiet dignity, now had a career and technology center named after him. And George Forrest had proven that the lessons he learned in that small town and on the football field and in the jungle of Vietnam applied to everything. George Forrest is in the Morgan State University ROTC Hall of Fame, along with other notable alumni including Earl Graves and Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg. He was interviewed multiple times for oral history projects, including by Joe Galloway for the Vietnam War commemoration. And his story is part of the collection at the Library of Congress. He has spoken at reunions of the Ia Drang veterans and at events honoring the soldiers who fought in those November days of 1965. When he talks about the men under his command, Forrest describes them as both grand and simple. They were guys who could find humor in anything, even in the worst circumstances. They were soldiers who did what soldiers do, which is follow orders and take care of each other and try to survive long enough to go home. There is a moment George Forrest talks about that helps him understand what his service meant. At one of the Ia Drang reunions years after the war, He was talking about the guilt he still felt about the 17 men he lost, and a young person came up to him. This was the child of one of the soldiers who had survived LZ Albany, and they said to Forrest, "I am here because you helped my father survive." That one sentence helped George Forrest move past some of the guilt he had been carrying since November 1965. It took people a long time to find Forrest because he had hidden well, not wanting to talk about what happened, not wanting to relive the demons. But when he finally did start talking, the stories he told helped other veterans and helped the families of the fallen understand what their fathers and husbands and brothers had gone through. Captain George Forrest was one of only a few African-American company commanders with combat commands in the 1st Cavalry Division during Vietnam. At a time when the military was still working through issues of race and integration, Forrest was out there leading soldiers into battle regardless of their color or background. He commanded the guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, one of the most prestigious assignments in the Army. He was an honor guard at the funeral of President Kennedy, standing in silent tribute as the nation mourned. He fought in one of the most significant battles of the Vietnam War and came out the other side with lessons that shaped everything he did afterward. All of these experiences made George Forrest who he was, and when he returned to civilian life, he brought all of that with him. When he went to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington for the first time, he did not like it at first. Most of the monuments in the Capitol are white marble, and they are above ground, where you can see the glory of whatever they commemorate. The Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument and all the other structures that celebrate American history stand tall and bright in the sun. But the wall is black granite, and it is cut into the earth, and you have to walk down into it to see the names. It seemed like the opposite of what a memorial should be. But then Forrest started reading the names and touching the stone, and he understood. The wall is not about glory. It is about grief and remembrance and the weight of sacrifice. The names are engraved there in chronological order of when the soldiers died, and you can trace the war by walking along the wall. The early panels have fewer names, and the middle panels are dense with casualties from the years when the fighting was heaviest, and then the numbers taper off again toward the end. Forrest knows the names of all 17 men he lost. They are engraved there on panel 3 East, along with the other 305 Americans who died in the Platoon campaign during October and November 1965. When Forrest goes to the wall, all of those men come rushing back into his conscious, and that is the struggle he lives with. He sees their faces and hears their voices and remembers the letters he had to write to their families. The wall gives him a place to go to honor them and to carry his grief to a place where others understand. George Forrest once said that what his generation of Vietnam veterans did was raise the awareness of the American public so that no returning soldiers would ever be treated the way they were treated. The 1st Cavalry Division came home to be told to get out of their uniforms before they got off the plane because they were going to have trouble in the airport. There were no parades and no ticker tape and no bands playing. But the men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and other conflicts get welcomed home and get thanked for their service, and that matters. Forrest said he is a little envious of that, but he understands that generations build on what came before, and if his generation suffered so that the next generation would be treated better, then that is a good trade. When Forrest was young, he used to watch the old World War I and World War II veterans dress up in their uniforms and hobble down the street in Veterans Day parades in small towns across America. Now he is one of those old veterans hobbling down the street, and he finally got his parade. The story of Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry has often been overlooked in the telling of the Ia Drang battles. The book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, focused primarily on LZ X-ray and the 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry under Hal Moore, and then the disaster that befell the 2nd Battalion 7th Cavalry at LZ Albany. George Forrest himself noted that, with the exception of articles by Joe Galloway and Jack Smith, his unit's actions are rarely mentioned. Even in the movie, there was no mention of Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry, and after all these years, that still hurts Forrest. He hopes that someday some writer will include the heroic actions of his soldiers so that their memory will be honored the way they deserve. When you sit with this story for a while, it is hard not to feel something for what men like George Forrest and Fred Klug and Daniel Torres went through. They were young men, sent into a war that most of them did not fully understand, in a place halfway around the world from everything they knew. They did what their country asked them to do, and some of them did not come home. And the ones who did come home carried pieces of that war with them for the rest of their lives. The Ia Drang Valley was just the beginning of what would become a decade-long war that would divide America and change how an entire generation thought about their country and their government. The lessons learned there about air mobility and firepower and the determination of the enemy would be studied for years afterward. But the human lessons are harder to quantify. The lesson Forrest learned about never being attached applies to more than just military tactics. It is about knowing who you can count on when everything falls apart. It is about taking care of your people and making sure they are prepared for whatever comes next. It is about running as fast as you can back to the people who need you, because that is where you belong. And it is about carrying the weight of the decisions you made and the decisions you did not make for as long as you live. George Forrest will tell you that you can go to hell and come out on the other side and be better for it. That is what Alpha Company 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry did coming out of the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. They lost friends, and they lost pieces of themselves, but they became stronger and sharper and more capable because of what they endured. The men who survived LZ Albany were changed by it in ways that civilians cannot fully understand. But they also found something in themselves that they did not know was there. They found out what they were capable of when everything was on the line, and there was no one coming to save them. They found out that they could depend on each other, and that the bonds formed in combat are different from any other bonds in life. Stories like this do not always get told the right way, if they get told at all. The official histories focus on the commanders and the grand strategy and the casualty figures, but they miss the individual soldiers and the moments of courage and fear and desperation that make up any battle. When you hear these stories from the people who were there, you understand why they matter. You understand that behind every name on a wall or a memorial is a person who had a family and dreams and a whole life ahead of them that was cut short. And you understand that the survivors carry those names with them forever. However you look at it, what George Forrest and his men did in November 1965 made a difference. And it still does today. The story of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, deserves to be remembered alongside the other stories from the Ia Drang. And George Forrest deserves to be recognized for the leader he was and the example he set for everyone who came after him.